Yes. One way to understand this is as it relates to examining evolution and the problems with evolution. If let's say half of the mutations resulted in some sort of functional improvement, then it would be much easier to evolve complexity, because then you could eliminate the bad and you end up with something good. So it's like, yeah, that would work really well. And this can be, I suppose, can be modeled computationally or whatever. It's a different story that when practically every mutation is either going to be hopefully not damaging or damaging, there are situations where, practically speaking, single isolated mutations would just result in damage without a whole bunch of simultaneous changes. It's just going to be damaging. And rather than talk about this abstractly, one good way to illustrate this is with ion channels. And they're just features that are just incredible, that to this day surpass technologies collectively of all the scientists and engineers on the planet. I recently talked to a scientist who will not be named. He's a physicist. He's very close to retirement, and maybe he can be more open. But we were talking, he said the capabilities of some of these systems, he said you could take all the scientists and engineers on the planet, we could not build it. If you just gave us the specifications of some of these systems and you said, okay, have at it, we could not build it. It is that sophisticated. We can, the irony is we can send people to the moon, we can build these space stations, we can build these space probes, we can build all these computers, but there are some things in biology that kind of would make us look like just toy manufacturers by comparison to the sophistication we see. And ion channels, which I hope to talk about today, are an example of some really spectacular sophistication. An ion is a molecular atom that has a charge to it, either positive or negative. And the cell or a membrane will pass. Okay, so the cell has a membrane, and in case of eukaryotes, it has lots of membranes even inside of it. So you have all these compartments, and these ions can go in and out, but they have to be done in a controlled way. Our nervous system would fail without these ion channels. So just look at it like a gatekeeper. Ion channels are like a gatekeeper. It's going to only allow certain things in or out under specific conditions. And how and that's basically it. So just look at it as a gatekeeper through a membrane. Just to underscore the importance of the ion channels, let's talk about what happens when we mutate ion channels. And this is from a paper, and there's the title: Ion Channels Related Diseases.
So we hear a lot of talk about beneficial mutations causing evolution. So is this kind of an example of mutations that don't benefit?
Yes. And I'm going to argue that most mutations that are isolated, meaning if we do it one at a time, it's going to be a disaster. It'll either be neutral at best or detrimental. And we can show that geometrically. That's why I like the ion channel. You can really see that. You can I'll show this more visually why. Because you're not going to get a situation where you get a mutation and half the time it's good and half the time it's bad. It's going to be, in the case, if they're isolated mutations and they're not happening, a whole bunch of them happening simultaneously, the tendency is that they're either going to be neutral to bad, which effectively saying it's never going to be good. Practically speaking, I mean, of course there are exceptions, but practically speaking, it's going to be rare. And the reason I cover the ion channels, we'll show some videos, I'll show some pictorial things. You can actually see visually the reason why. Rather than appealing to theoretical papers, you can see it visually. But first, let me just read the abstract about what happens when ion channels are mutated. There are many diseases related to ion channels. Mutations in muscle voltage-gated sodium, potassium, calcium, and chlorine channels and acetylcholine-gated channels may lead to such physiological disorders as hyper and hypokalemic periodic paralysis, myotonia, long QT syndrome, Brugada syndrome, malignant hyperthermia, and myasthenia. Neuronal disorders, epilepsy, episodic ataxia, familiar hemiplegic migraine, Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, hyperreflexia, and may result from the dysfunction of voltage-gated sodium, potassium, and calcium channels, or acetylcholine and glycine-gated channels. Some kidney disorders, Barter's syndrome, polycystic kidney disease and Dent's disease, secretion disorders, hyperinsulinic hypoglycemia of infancy and cystic fibrosis, vision disorders, e.g. congenital stationary night blindness and total color blindness may also be linked to mutations in ion channels. I mean, you could take this down now.
Do we have any examples of good mutations that happen in ion channels?
Not to my knowledge. Mm-hmm. And when we watch this next video, I think we'll see why. It's not that you can't take a basic ion channel and improve upon it, but the improvements have to be simultaneous. There's a saying, what good is half a wing? That was by Stephen Jay Gould. But at the molecular level, you really see it, unless sometimes you have a major overhaul. It's not going to work. So it's like, if you've seen some of these stretch limousines, what they have to do is cut the car in half and then add the stuff in the middle. Then you have a functioning, but you have to stop the process for a while, and it can't be drivable for a long time until you're done rebuilding it. You can't just take a screwdriver and start, you can't take the car and cut it in half and then it's functional. It's just not going to work that way. Essentially, it has to be totally overhauled. The problem with single isolated mutations is it's kind of like cutting the car in half. And then what do you do then? You started out with a functioning car, and now you have a dysfunctional one. So there's a saying that I don't know that it's unique to Walter Brown, but I first got it in his book. He said, an arm will become a bad arm first before it becomes a good wing. So it's an idea, if you're going to make a stretch limousine, it's going to be a non-functioning car for a long time before it can be a functioning stretch limousine. And so back to your question, are there any, I've known an isolated mutation here or there that has caused improvement? I'd say no. And I'll defend that for certain classes of ion channels. So we'll start with a very basic ion channel, this particular channel. And if you could bring that up, and we'll play how this works.
The bacterial potassium channel is a multi-pass transmembrane protein in the plasma membrane. It is built from 4 identical subunits that are arranged symmetrically. A pore in the center of the protein allows selective passage of potassium ions across the membrane. 4 rigid protein loops, one contributed by each subunit, form a selectivity filter at the narrowest part of the pore. This structure is responsible for the channel's high degree of selectivity for potassium ions over sodium ions. In this selectivity filter, carbonyl groups line the walls of the pore. These carbonyl groups are spaced precisely to interact with an unsolvated potassium ion, balancing the energy required to remove its hydration shell. Passage of a sodium ion through the channel is energetically unfavorable because the sodium is too small for optimal interaction with the carbonyl groups.
So in that Sal, what happened to the sodium? It was too small, and then what happened to it?
This is very interesting because normally we would think something too small would easily pass. Right? If we built a hole, it'll let something go through this, not quite as big as the hole or anything smaller. You'd need a pretty clever scientist to figure that out. So we could see the tight fitting of the parts here of this is a man-made nut and bolt. And you could see the precision that if the nut or the bolt, so the bolt fits with that nut. If you change the size of the nut or the bolt, there's no way you can make it better. This will carry over to the ion channel. But so let's just focus on the man-made side of this. I mean, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. How can you improve on that? It's like, well, okay, we could make all sorts of machines and all, and we can take the metal and reform it and make something else like if we had enough, we could make a car engine. But the point is, for that particular system, the parts have to be well matched together. Variation from that is damaging. And this carries over to so many of the biological systems at the molecular level. You're either going to break it or you hope you don't do too much damage, because you're not going to improve it. And if you could show that again, I'm going to go to the next slide. We looked at that potassium ion channel. Here's a different view of the potassium ion channel with on the right, with a rendering of what they call Richardson ribbon diagram. Now I modified it slightly. There's some extra tails there that I clipped off, but you can see it looks a little bit like a nut with a hole through it. I don't know that, correct me, check that. This is a particular ion channel. I don't know that it's specifically the potassium. So the idea that the size of that hole, that channel, that tunnel, basically, if it's just an angstrom or a fractional angstrom too big, it's going to fail as a potassium ion channel. If it's too small, it's going to fail. It has to be just right. So that nut and bolt is kind of a good analogy, in that if the size of the hole in the nut is too large, it's going to fail. If it's too narrow, it's going to fail too. It's a very similar thing with ion channels like the potassium. It has to be just the right size. And that nut and bolt is probably precise within maybe microns, or millimeters. But that ion channel has to be precise to within sub-angstroms, sometimes smaller than the atomic radius, fractional atomic radius of those ions. I don't know that anyone knows how to engineer things with that level of precision without a great deal of difficulty. And so,
well, Sal, when I often hear the idea that, well, it wasn't perfect at the beginning. Maybe, there were non-functional parts that, eventually became functional, or maybe they once, there's the exaptation where it started out as something else. And then, a mutation, it was used as a different function until the point where it mutated to this degree. Do you think, is that a reasonable explanation? And is this, with millions of years to work on this with natural selection, do you think that's something that can happen?
No. And there are two ways to go about this. Let's try to prove it. You heard all those diseases. How about we get a cell that needed the potassium ion channel, and why don't you rip it out? You can re-engineer genomes of some of these. Like we saw the one that we showed was a bacterial. Knock it out. See if it lives. See if it's going to evolve back. Wouldn't that be That would be a scientific test of that hypothesis. And if you say it's going to, well, you have to invoke millions of years. At that point, whether it's reasonable or not, you're going into territory that's faith-based, not fact-based. And I could say, I think that's absurd. And they'll say, no, that's how it worked. And I'll say, okay, it's your word against mine. You don't have any experiments to prove it, do you? Because I could probably point to lots of experiments, say like over the next 100 years, you're not going to see it get anywhere near that, assuming the cell's even alive at that point. And so that's where I try to say is, for some of us on our, with my sympathies and yours, we're tempted to say, absolutely, it'll fail. That might be our opinion, but maybe the more conservative thing to say is that's accepted by faith by evolutionists. That is not actually proven fact. And we can give reasons why we don't find it believable. And maybe that's as far as we can go. But from an engineering standpoint, and like I said, my professor in neuroscience that studied this, people like us would be like, well, give us the details. Because any system that has that much sensitivity to change, it's like, it may not get you where you think. And we could get even deeper into actually how many simultaneous changes are needed. Because I looked at the protein amino acid sequence of some of these channels, and I'm just like, yeah, in your dreams. So it'd be interesting to see what the critics will respond to this, because when I put this on the table, I've not gotten any responses similar to their response to the topoisomerase when I put that on the table. So that is an illustration. What I tried to illustrate here is they'll say, oh, we can modify this protein and it'll have different enzymatic function. I'll grant that. But there are definitely times we can make a change to a protein and it will have a new function. My point is, you can't extrapolate that to systems like this. This system is what we call multimeric. And if we could show that video again, I'm going to show one section here. This is a multimeric protein. What that means is it's actually not just one protein, it's actually four. The proper term is polypeptide. So when the gene expresses the potassium ion channel, it has to make 4 identical copies. And so in this video, she said it's composed, this is made of 4 identical subunits. So when the gene for the potassium ion channel, what we call the K channel, because K is the chemical symbol for potassium. When that gene is translated, it has to make 4 identical copies of the protein. Strictly speaking, I'll say polypeptide. Those polypeptides then have to fit together to make this complex. So this isn't expressed, it isn't like the gene is expressed once and you have a potassium ion channel. It makes 4, and somehow they're assembled to connect just right. So it makes that hole in the center just the right size to sub-angstrom, subatomic, not subatomic, fractional radius of an ion, like say potassium. It has to be that precise. So you need.
So these aren't globs of Play-Doh that you can stick together in any way you want. Each thing is like connected chemically. Is that
very precisely? It takes foresight. That's why I talked to this scientist who I will not name, and he said, "Yeah, this is what we call a multimeric protein. Multimeric, multi meaning many, and meric meaning these polymers. So these multiple polymers hooking together. The way you change the size of that hole, or even if the hole exists in the first place, is to change the spelling of the protein. So this isn't like when you're in Dad's workshop and he's milling things to make parts. He's using all these tools to shape it. The way you shape things for proteins is to spell them right. And then some other things with like a chaperoning process, an assembly process, or whatever. But so it takes spelling. The first level is spelling it right, what we call the primary structure. How do you know how to spell something so it's going to shape this way? This is why it's such a difficult problem. If I went to a protein engineer and said, okay, make something like this, you figure out how to spell the sequence and it's going to make this. He'd probably say, that's a real headache. I don't know that I could do it. We may not have the computational power. That's what I call the second protein. The first protein folding problem is you're given a sequence, figure out how it folds. The harder protein folding problem is, let's try to make something this shape, see if you can actually spell something that will make that shape. I mean, you think our headaches and spelling is hard. This is a really tough spelling problem. And this is like, say, a sequence of 1,000. Each of those colored blobs there is about 1,000. And you have to spell it so that you can anticipate it's going to make, when you make 4 of these, they're going to connect together like that. And that's not even I'll show you in another segment, we'll cover just how hard this is to stitch into that membrane, into that cell barrier. And so the point of this was, how difficult is it to mutate? So I'll grant that we can have mutations in isolated enzymes, and it'll give it a slightly different enzymatic function. You cannot extrapolate that to this situation. And you could take this down, and I have one anecdote I want to give. Many people know that I've been a professional gambler. And what a professional gambler has to do is understand expected value. He has to know that his rate of winning is enough to overcome his losses, and that he can eventually take down the casino. And usually the casino will not allow you to do that because they'll kick you out before you can take all their money away. So we call these skilled gamblers advantage players, because we play with our advantage. Now the unskilled gamblers we call ploppies, because they get into the seat at the table or at the slot machine and they just kind of plop down. So we call them ploppies. So you have 2 classes of gamblers. You have the players like me, and then you have the ploppies. The ploppies, I know that sounds so derogatory, but that's from my casino days. Some of them, it's really sad. They're very addicted to gambling, and they get that thrill out of winning occasionally. And so in their mind, they focus on all the thrills of winning. They erase in their minds all the agonies of defeat. So if you have enough substantial losses, it's going to negate all the gains. And the problem with evolutionary theory is they'll look at some of these isolated examples of a new functional improvement that's usually very trivial. They'll forget about all the ones where it's disastrous. They wrongly assume that the disastrous or the compromised will be eliminated, and it's not necessarily eliminated. Sometimes it is if it's severe enough, but these can accumulate. And they never kind of do an analysis. It's like if for every functional improvement we have 100 that are compromising, what's going to be the net result? And then you have to figure out, it's a little bit more complex than that when you have to figure in like population sizes and all that. But we know from laboratory and field observation that a lot of times something that's actually good will be lost anyway. So the reason for that is something that's functionally good might be expensive to retain in terms of reproductive success. And I've talked about how, like, being a very intelligent woman, many of them do not have children. So in the evolutionary sense, being smart would be a deleterious trait, whereas being not so smart is a beneficial trait. So what ends up happening is there's a net selective pressure against maintaining intelligence. We're getting dumber and dumber. And to quote a particular evolutionist, who doesn't like me saying it, he said, no, maybe the best thing for the human race is we get dumber and dumber until we all lose our minds. He resents me saying that and quoting him because it makes him look kind of stupid. But I'm like, you actually articulated the problem concisely. The evolutionary viewpoint is it's all about reproductive success. It's not about functional improvement. And that's rooted in the fact they don't like the teleological language, because you clearly see it when you start to use teleological language. So saying the word dumber and dumber versus intelligent is actually already starting to be teleological language, because you're making value judgments based on functionality, not reproductive success.
Wow. Yeah. So we're not seeing a path for how collective mutations could improve the ion channel. And we see very easy ways for the ion channel to be disrupted in a way that's destructive to the organism.
Exactly. And what I would say, just to qualify a little bit, we don't see a way we could do this piecemeal, like the way Dawkins and Darwin envisioned, one little increment at a time. It has to be wholesale changes. So what would cause all these coordinated mutations to suddenly happen that you take, like, say, that basic ion channel that we were showing and then make it a voltage gated, where it has now these features where you could switch it off and on?
Now, how many mutations, and I know you're probably like estimated, how many mutations would that take to make a change like that? And I know you can't probably say an exact number, but I mean,
I can't give it off the top of my head, but from the sizes, we can estimate just by looking at the sizes of a plain vanilla ion channel and then a voltage gated ion channel, like, say, the potassium. And my recollection is it's like on the order of a few hundred at least. And that's just in size changes. We're not even talking about sequence changes. In another show, I'll also show there's another difficulty, and it's the stitching, it's the construction of it, it's the insertion into it's what we call translocation process. There has to be codes in the there have to be codes, quote unquote codes in the sequence that tell it how to construct, how to translocate it into the membrane. And that's a subject of another show. So there's not just sensitivity in terms of the shape. There's sensitivity in terms of the construction process, that there has to be, there's almost like overlapping codes, you might say, so to speak. You have the code that gives it the final shape, but then you have codes that are intermediate that helps the machines construct it. Because it's kind of like when you have, when you're assembling, assembling furniture or whatever, you might have little markers or things that kind of tell you how to do it. This side here, this side there, this part there. This is how it's supposed to connect. So there are these embedded markers that tell the other machines that are constructing this complex how to build it and insert it in the cell. And that's like another code. So there's a difficulty, is like you have to get it to do two things at once. And you have to conceive of this. This is like having to write a letter that has hidden messages in it. If you're going to write, say, a paragraph, and then you look, like, say, all the letters, the way that that they end each of the words, and you take it, you can come up with these secret messages. And there's some examples of this. It's very difficult to build that. It's what we call polyconstrained. This system is polyconstrained at least on three levels that I could see. One, the construction code that has to be there. The other, that it's multimeric, so all these parts will connect. And then having the foresight to see that after it connects, it makes this functional channel. That's why it would take genius of several orders of magnitude above anything we know on this planet to build that. And so when evolutionists will tell me natural selection can build it, I said, prove it.